I'll leave this here. I just wanted to make sure I could move it.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Is this working? Jonathan? Yeah, I can hear it. Okay. Welcome. Thank you for coming to the forum today. This is Lizzie Appleby from the Pride Youth Services of the Youth Services of Glenview, Northbrook. We invited Lizzie to come today to talk about this topic as we are renewing our certification as a welcoming congregation. And we're going to be sending that renewal application in this week. So we want to make sure that we've at least given some other opportunities for learning around this area, around this topic. So welcome, and with that, I will let Lizzie talk.
Okay, I just like to be able to move, so I want to pull it off. So hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here today. Again, my name's Lizzie. My pronouns are she and her. I am the Pride Director at Youth Services in Glenview. Yes. Oh, am I supposed to do that? I just don't know what the protocol is. Oh, great. Didn't know that. Is that better? Yeah, probably way better for everyone. Everywhere is different, so I never know. Cool. So again, my name's Lizzie. My pronouns are she and her. I am the Pride Director at Youth Services, which is a nonprofit organization based in Glenview. I want to share a little bit before I start just about Youth Services and what we do and who we are and what my role is there. Youth Services, like I said, is a nonprofit. We serve youth and families in a variety of different ways. Many of my colleagues are social workers and counselors who work with young people around all different kinds of mental health concerns. So whether that's anxiety, depression, family conflict, peer conflict, all kinds of stuff. We offer our mental health services with a very generous sliding scale, so no family is ever turned away because of ability to pay. We also offer quite a bit of after-school programming, particularly to some geographic communities in Glenview and Northbrook that are under-resourced for a variety of reasons to help connect those families to us and to mental health resources or financial assistance should they need that. And then in addition to that, we do some crisis intervention with local schools and some work like this in the community teaching about how to support young people in all different kinds of ways. All of that work is awesome. For the most part, it's not my job. What I do there is that I oversee the Pride Youth Program. So the Pride Youth Program is the largest LGBTQ youth program in the northern suburbs. We see between 200 and 250 LGBTQ plus young people a year. Our youngest program right now starts in second grade, and we go all the way through high school and sometimes some young adult programming as well. Our Pride Youth Program has sort of three branches. So we have our Pride Connect programming, which is about helping young people and families build connections to one another. So we do that through events. Our Pride Support Groups, which are our weekly groups for young people. We currently run 7 weekly groups for young people. And then we have a Pride Lead program for LGBTQ high school students who want to become leaders in their community and community advocates around educating and supporting LGBTQ young people and LGBTQ issues on the North Shore. So in terms of geography, like where our young people come from, we have no I know that our name is Youth Services of Glenview Northbrook, so people think that it is only young people from Glenview and Northbrook. It's a little confusing, but that's not true. We see young people from as far south as the north side of the city and as far north as like Gurney, Grays Lake, so pretty far up into Lake County, east to the lake, and I would say west to about Arlington Heights or so, tends to be sort of where folks come from. So that's just a little bit about the Pride program specifically. So again, my role there is I oversee all of that work, which means that I also get the really joyful job of going out into the community and sharing with people some things that young people would like for adults in their community to know about how to support them and how to include them. So that is what we will be doing today, specifically talking about how to support trans and gender-expansive community members. Obviously, most of my experience is working with young people, but we will also talk about what that looks like in terms of engagement with other adults as well, because it's not that different. So we will be talking about that today. Before we dive into that, I should ask, are there any questions about youth services and what we do before I? Okay, great. My clicker is having a bit of a time. Okay, so here's our plan. We're going to do some review of gender terminology. I'm assuming some folks in this space might be pretty familiar with the stuff that some of the things we're talking about. That's awesome. Please share what you know. I'm also assuming there are some people in this space who might not be very familiar with some of the things we're talking about. That is cool too. So that is why we are reviewing all of that stuff together. We'll talk a little bit about why it's so important that we focus on including trans and gender-expansive people, and then review specifically around pronoun use and how to use pronouns effectively to make sure that we're making inclusive spaces. So that's kind of our plan for today, but if there's other questions or curiosities that folks are coming in with, feel free to raise those. The kind of goal thing about having a bit of a small group here is that if people have questions, we can kind of follow where folks' curiosity is. So I want to make sure that we give space for that as well. Yes? We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about that. So hold on to that question because that's like specifically one of the big things we're talking about today. Man, I'm like really at a poor angle for this clicker. Okay. So before we dive into that, I want to do just a little bit of group agreements, kind of setting the scene. Maybe if I switch my hand. There we go. So group agreements for our space, some ground rules for our time together. Sorry, now I'm standing in front of it. So the first one is just that we respect and support each other in this space. Again, everyone comes to this conversation from a different place. Some people know a lot. Some people know not very much. All of that is cool. In the spirit of that, right, all questions are welcome. It is my assumption that if you are asking a question, it's because you want to know the answer. So you don't need to feel like you have to have all the right words to ask the question or like know exactly how to say it. Please just ask the question in the best way you know so that we can learn together. The plot can leave, but keep the characters here, right? So I just ask that you don't leave this space and be like, did you hear what so-and-so said at the gender workshop last week? Like, can you believe that? Because that doesn't make people feel comfortable to ask those questions. It's vulnerable sometimes to learn, so I just want to be respectful of that. Speaking from I, so please speak from your own perspective. So if you have an experience or something you want to share, use our I statements, right? Like, in my experience, I've noticed blank, 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 blank versus everyone, blah, 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 right? Does that make sense? Okay. Share the air, so be mindful that we do have a group in here, so we want to hear from multiple people. So just be mindful of not taking up too much space, and then practice self-care however you need to. So if you need to get up and walk out of the room for whatever reason, feel free to do that. Walk in front of me, it's okay. Sometimes people feel like they need permission for that, so want to let people know that's fine. Anything that folks want to add to this list, things we need from each other for this conversation? Are these things we could all agree to? Nods are helpful. Great, I loved that affirmative consent in here today. That was great. Awesome. Oops. There we go. Okay, so we're going to do a little check-in. So I'm going to invite you to turn to someone near you. Bonus points if it's someone you don't already know super well. We might be really full of people that really know each other well, which is fine. That's cool. But if you don't, good moment to reach out to someone you might not. And practice introducing ourselves with our pronouns. So if this is new for you, I did this when I started, right? So this is how you want people to refer to you, right? So if I walked out the door, right, my pronouns are she and her, so you would say, she walked out the door. But if my pronouns were he, him, right, you would be like, he walked out the door. So this is how you want people to refer to you. So the way you would say this is, my name is whatever your name is, so my name is Lizzy, and my pronouns are she, her. If that's new for you, again, we're going to review this more in depth. That is cool. Do your best with it, and then we'll circle back. And just share one thing that you're hoping to get out of today in our conversation with each other. Cool? Okay, find your friend. Go. Chatty. Which is great. I love that. People seem on topic. Great. Just do it. Okay. All right. I'm going to ask everyone to go ahead and land their planes, wrap up their thoughts. Yeah. I'm going to. It's on my list. Yeah. Just want to get us started. We're just getting started. All right. For real, though, land your planes. Come back together. Look at us go. We're almost there. Awesome. So it's like, do we need a quiet coyote? That's what I do with young people. Okay, awesome. I'm glad that folks are wanting to talk with one another. That's great. Can I get a couple of people who are willing to share something that they're wanting to get out of today? That they're sitting with? Yeah.
I'd like to know a little bit about the history of the importance of pronouns to people, particularly people of LGBTQ persuasion. It felt like it came on suddenly
Sure.
to me, the recent requests
Sure.
to be mindful of that, and I would like to know the history of that.
Love that. That's great. For folks who maybe couldn't hear that, was sort of wanting to understand a little bit more about the history of pronouns and their importance, especially sort of this feeling of like all of a sudden we were talking about pronouns and before we weren't, and why are we not? Why is it happening now? And where is it coming from? So awesome, for sure. We can talk a little bit more about that. Maybe one or two other folks. Yeah.
This is my first time here, but I'm here in part because of this. We just recently, 3 weeks ago, learned that our youngest, our 12-year-old, is a transgender boy. Cool. So we are in the process of lots of learning and have already contacted
Great. Awesome. So for folks who might not have heard that, so parent of a young person in the space who's recently exploring their identity, so looking for more learning and understanding around that. And I saw a hand over here, I think. Yes.
As a gay man, I want to be more mindful of the trans community because they often get left out, and
Totally.
the T is just like, over here somewhere.
Totally.
And nomenclature changes, what people want to be called and how. So I just kind of want to keep abreast of that. Maybe some things have changed since 5 years ago, 10 years ago, or whatever.
6 months ago. Yeah. Yeah, totally, right? So recognizing, right, that when we say LGBTQ, right, we often say all those letters together, but there's a lot of different experiences in there, right? Sexuality and gender are not the same, so we're going to review that in a second. And so especially for trans and gender-expansive folks, like sometimes when we talk about LGBTQ, we're really talking about the LGB side of that, right, the sexuality side, and we're sort of missing including trans and gender-expansive people. So wanting to be mindful of that, and especially thinking about how language changes all the time. And so how do we deal with that, right, in a practical sense, and how do we sort of stay updated and sort of engaged? Awesome. Great. Yeah, oh, one more. Go for it.
Since I have a niece that declares herself Q, I want more understanding about queer, what that means.
Great. Yeah, so looking for some more information about what queer means, what that could mean for people. Awesome. So, there we go. Okay, so let's start with some basic terminology stuff so we're all on the same page. Again, I'm going to say this a couple of times because I think it's something that people get a little stuck on, right? So when we talk about gender, gender is about who you are, right? You as an individual, who you are, right? And our sexuality, right, is about who we like. So that's about our relationship with other people, right? So gender, who we are, sexuality, who we like. So any person of any gender can have any sexuality, right? They're not necessarily connected. So someone could identify as a gay person, right, and not be trans, right? And someone could identify as transgender and also identify as straight, right? So these are not the same. They're not the same, which I think sometimes they get, again, we use that acronym, so they get all lumped together all the time, so this gets a little confusing. So we're going to circle back to that again. But there we go. Okay, so let's start here. So all of us, right, when we are born, they look at our parts and they go, it's a girl, right, or it's a boy. Really, it's before you're born. I'm pregnant, so I'm really living that right now. But, right, it's even before that, right? We're looking at people's genitals and we're giving them a label, right, based on what body parts they have. So that's what we call our sex assigned at birth, right? That's the box they check on your birth certificate. What is important to know about sex assigned at birth is that people's bodies do not actually always fit nicely into two categories. So some people are born what we call intersex. You might have heard I'm going to just use this term so that folks know what we're talking about. You might have previously heard the term hermaphrodite or hermaphroditic. That term is no longer in use. It is considered offensive unless we are specifically talking about a very specific medical condition. Many intersex people there are like more than 30 different kinds of intersex conditions or experiences, so it's not specific, but intersex refers to anyone whose body parts, when I say body parts, we're talking chromosomes, hormones, internal organs, and external organs, right? So someone whose body parts do not fit neatly into the category of male or female. So that could be somebody who has a hormone balance that's a little bit different, who has XXY instead of XX or XY chromosomes, so they have all three. Could be someone who has the internal organs of both sexes, right, but the external organs of only one. So there's lots of different ways people could be born intersex. Intersex people have existed forever, right? This is not necessarily like a new thing, it's just that the language around it has shifted a little bit. And I think it's helpful to remember, right, that our bodies do not fit nicely into two categories either. So when we start talking about our gender, that won't fit into two categories either. So just remember that there are more than two ways to be, right? That's an important takeaway from our kind of conversation today. Questions about what it means to be intersex or sex assigned at birth? Intersex, INTERSEX, intersex. Yeah. Uh-huh. Yes. 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 So there has been a lot of political activism around how we treat intersex babies or babies who are born intersex. We don't always know when a baby is born intersex, right? If it's a hormone balance, it's not like we're checking babies' hormone levels or anything, right, when they're born. So sometimes people don't know until they're much older, but sometimes if it's what we call ambiguous genitalia, right, so it's unclear whether it's a penis or a vagina, like we aren't sure. The historical practice has been to make a decision. Like the medical provider makes a decision and change it, like perform surgery on a baby to decide what kind of genitals they will have. The problem with that is that then that was often hidden from young people, so they grew up and they didn't know. And then they experienced a lot of suffering later because then their gender identity was different than the choice that had been made for them. So there's been, particularly here in Chicago, there was a lot of activism around Lurie's, trying to end intersex surgery. So that's something that you might have seen in the media or you can look up later if you're interested. But so there's been a lot of activism around that as well, for sure. So our sex assigned at birth, right? Label we're given at birth based on the parts we're born with. That's different than our gender identity. Our gender identity is who we know ourselves to be, right? Our internal felt sense of who we are. So for example, I identify as a girl, right? My gender identity is woman. That's who I know myself to be. That's how I feel comfortable. The other most common gender identity that we see, right, is male or man, right? So someone who identifies as a man. So for most people, our sex assigned at birth and our gender identity are the same. Most people, right? So I was born, they looked at my parts, they went, it's a girl, and here I am later, and I'm like, yes, I'm a girl, right? What's the word for that? Cisgender, yeah, right? Cisgender, right? So someone whose gender identity is the same as their sex assigned at birth, right? Or cis, we sometimes just hear it said as cis. So for example, I am a cis woman or a cisgender woman, right, is how we would say that. It's an adjective, right? So someone is not a cisgender, right? On the same side as. It's a prefix. Yeah. Your gender, my laser doesn't work on here. Yeah. So it means that Your gender identity is the same as your sex assigned at birth. So these two things are the same. So they match, basically. It might be, right, historically, we might have used the word normal to talk about that, right? We don't. The reason why we don't say that, right? Why, can you tell me why we don't say that? Person who just laughed, because I think you know. Right, it implies that someone else is abnormal, right? Yeah, absolutely. But so that's why it's important that we have a word to talk about it, right? Because if we don't have words to talk about the majority experience, right, then we're only talking about the other experience, right, as if it is wrong or bad, usually, because that's what humans do. We love a binary. So that's what cisgender means, right? Cisgender means same as. Didn't mean to call you out, that wasn't. Just felt like you were with me. Oops, okay. Sometimes, right, for some people, our gender identity and our sex assigned at birth are different, right? So someone is born, they look at the parts and they go, it's a girl, right? And then later, that person grows up and they're like, no, I'm not a girl, I'm a boy, right? Or vice versa, or something else. So that's what we call being trans, right, or transgender. So someone whose gender identity is different than their sex assigned at birth. Again, an adjective, right? Someone is not a transgender. They are a trans man or a transgender woman, or vice versa, or some combination thereof, trans person. Questions about that? Yeah.
I have thought fairly erroneously that someone who is trans has already made a decision to change their physical characteristics to match
Yes.
their identity. But what you're saying is their internal experience is different from the sex that they were assigned at birth, whether or not they are cross-dressing and changing their
Correct. Yes, that's a common misconception, so I'm really glad you said that. So for many, many years, right, there was a lot of what we would call gatekeeping, right, around this identity of trans, right, or transgender, that in order to identify as trans, you had to, like, do something. Like, you had to get surgeries, or you had to present yourself in a certain way, or you had to do something, right? We have shifted our thinking around that, right, for a variety of reasons, but most importantly, because not everyone has access to transition, right, which is what we're talking about. So those things that you do, right, so whether they're medical changes, like surgeries or hormones, or legal changes, like legally changing your name, or more social transitions, like wearing different clothes, or having people call you by a different name, right, things like that. Not everyone has access to that, right, whether because it's unsafe, or because it costs a lot of money, or because they're not old enough to be able to do it without parent consent, or whatever set of reasons, right? And so instead, we've really shifted our focus onto people's internal felt sense of who they are, right? So the short version of this is when people tell us who they are, we believe them, right? Because we believe that people know themselves better than anybody else, right? Because we live in our own head. So that's, yeah, I'm glad you said that. So this is a shift to in language that you might have folks, especially older folks in the room, might have heard the word transsexual more commonly used, right? We don't typically use that word anymore either. The word transgender, or just trans, you can't go wrong with trans, is more commonly used. That is also a reflection a little bit of some of that, like, gatekeeping behavior. That's part of why that language has shifted. Any other questions? Yeah.
We are including non-binary and fluid folks also in.
I'm getting there. Rock on. That was great. So, boop, boop. Man. My clicker is just not working today. Great. All right. So again, these are like big picture categories, right, that we're talking about, right? People are trans or they're cis. We also have, like, gender identity labels, right, that I've touched on those already, right? So my gender identity label for me would be woman, right? That's the word I use to describe myself. You brought up our label of non-binary, right? So these two most common words that we know, male and female, we call those the binary gender identities, right? By, like, two most common. Okay, so that's why they're the binary gender identities. Most people, regardless of whether they are cis or trans, most people identify with one of those two binary gender identities. Some people do not identify with one of those two binary options, and that is what we mean, that is what the word non-binary means in terms of gender. So someone who identifies as non-binary identifies as something other than those first two binary genders. So something other than male and female, other than man, woman, boy, girl, however you want to say that. Many non-binary people also identify as trans, some don't. So key takeaway around all this language stuff that I just disclaimer, okay? So these are generally how these terms are used. We always use the language that somebody uses to describe themselves, right? We don't ever ascribe language to somebody that they don't want, because it's not our job to tell other people who they are. When people tell us who they are, we believe them, right? Yes? Correct. Yes.
I can experience myself as neither completely male or completely female, and that's a normal state.
Correct.
Not necessarily a state of confusion, malady, malfunction. It's a state of normalcy that we're now accepting that non-binary experience is possible.
Correct. Yes. So again, right, theme of the day, right? More than two ways to be. So this idea, right, that being neither male nor female is there, it's not, and I love that you said it's not confused or trying to figure it out, because sometimes I think we sort of land there. This is its own set of gender experience. It is also an umbrella category unto itself, that there are many, many, many non-binary gender identities. That's that little and so many more over there in the corner, but we'll talk about that in a second.
Still a Dsm category.
Um,
Do we not call it gender?
No, that we do. So there is a Dsm diagnosis. So for folks who are not familiar with the DSM is the big book of mental health diagnoses that we use to find the codes to bill insurance mostly. To be honest, I mean, that's I think as a practitioner, that is correct. So we have a code to talk about it. The reason why we have a code is to cover people's health care related to supporting their gender exploration, supporting their transition, stuff like that. Yeah. Yeah. Sure. 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 I love that question. I think that's important. I think that when we're talking about sort of label language, right? So there's a little bit of tension, I think, between wanting to be enormously expansive in our understandings of gender, right? I think I called this gender as a universe, right? The idea that gender is a universe, right? That everyone's experience of their gender is unique, that you and I might use the same labels to talk about our gender, right? But have vastly different experiences, that we all have parts of ourselves that are more masculine or more feminine, right? That we're all unique people, right? I don't think this model is in conflict with that necessarily. I think what this is about is honoring that there are some distinctions between the ways that people might experience their life, and that people want words to talk about that. I think the labels sort of serve two functions, right? One is to say oh, there's other, I'm okay, right? To be there's a word for me, there's a word for my experience, and that tells me I'm okay. The other really important function of these labels, right, is they help us find other people like us, right? So they help us find community, right, of other people who have similar experiences, and that's really powerful. So that's part of the reason why there are so many identity words and labels. It's also true, as a person who works with young people, that often these labels are tremendously important to young people, and then as people get older, they become less and less important, right? So, and that's just part of, again, having a more expansive understanding of the world that comes with age and development. And not for everybody, but I think for a lot of people, that's true. Yeah? Either male or female. Correct. Yes, not one of those, yes, not male or female. So I want to show an image that I think is going to kind of speak into this a little bit. And I've just given up on the clicker, so I'm sorry. Just decided it's too hard. So it's really scientific. It came from Twitter. But I think it does a great job of exploring this idea of gender as a universe, right? This idea that gender is expansive. So we might have used to think of this as like this sort of spectrum idea, right? That there's like male on one side and female on the other side, and that non-binary is like smack dab in the middle. Sorry, it's small. I couldn't make it bigger without it going all blurry on me. This is maybe a different way of thinking about this, right? That people think of this as like three-dimensional, right? There are infinite numbers of gender experiences. There are infinite sort of ways to be. There are all different kinds of labels, right? And again, in practical terms, the most important takeaway is that when people tell us who they are, we believe them, right? But I think this is about expanding our understanding of the infinite possibilities of ways for people to be. Does that make sense? Okay, sort of. At least we're with me? Okay. So again, when we talk about non-binary experience, and so for example, you brought up the term, I think you said gender fluid too, right? So there are many, many different non-binary identities that sort of, if you think of non-binary as an umbrella, there are lots of words under that. Common one we might hear is gender fluid. Would you like to share a definition of gender fluid? Sure, right? So it's fluid, it's like water changing over time, right? So someone whose gender identity shifts over time. There's no like set time period for that, right? So that could be over years, it could be over days, it could be over weeks, class periods, whatever. Yeah.
Again, that's an internal feeling.
Correct.
It's not that I'm with a woman, and so I think that I'm attracted to a woman.
Correct.
With a man, I'm attracted to a man.
Internal felt sense of who we are, right? Because again, we're differentiating gender, right? Who we are versus our sexuality, which is who we're attracted to. Yeah. Yeah. It just all says non-binary. It doesn't say anything. They're just like all different examples. Oh my gosh, no. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. No. It's just like an example. So again, there could be infinite points on that little circle. It's just like to move us out of maybe like a two-dimensional spectrum idea into a more, I'm not good at dimensions, but there we go. Yep, that.
What I've been thinking of in my head is the Vulcan model from Star Trek, infinite diversity and infinite combinations. So does that cover it?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so I love that we went to Star Trek. I'm having a great day. That's where we're at. Cool. So before I do that, let's just pause for the class. Any other questions about like vocab, like labels and language about how people talk about themselves? Yeah. How are they connected? Yeah. So I would say, I think most commonly, again, making space for people who don't see it this way, but most commonly, we think of trans as the umbrella, right? So anyone who's sex assigned at birth is different than their gender identity could be trans, right? Many trans people have binary identities. Some trans people don't identify as male or female at all. So let me go back one slide so you can see what I'm talking about. Okay. So some trans people are non-binary. Not every non-binary person identifies as trans, but some trans people are non-binary. Yeah, I was trying to do a geometry metaphor, but I lost it. Yeah.
And is it common for gender fluid to identify as they, them?
Yes. So often, right, when we get to the pronoun place, so when we hear they, them pronouns, right, often non-binary people will use they, them pronouns, right, because they're not using he, him, or she, her, because they're not identifying as one of the two binary genders. Not always, but often. Yes. there's just really terrible data. It's terrible data around it. So no, like the estimates vary like hugely in terms of percentages, because part of it has to do with how they ask the questions and who they sample. And people haven't historically funded a lot of research around trans people. So no, I don't even want to give you a number because it's just not. They're not great numbers. Yes. For sure. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Great. I'm going to get there in one. I'm almost there. That's the last thing I'm going to say before we go to the next thing. Yes. One and then one. Uh-huh. On the same side as. Yeah. Yes.
So I just wanted to, with regard to data, you know, it's just been a struggle to have to catch myself, you know, having some kind of unconscious bias about what and then I realize, catch myself and correct myself, but then the damage is already done, because I've screwed it up.
Totally.
How much do I apologize and whatever. And, you know, all our lives we've thought of they as them as a group of people.
Totally.
Not a singular thing. So
Totally. Yeah, and I'm going to sit with that in just a second. So I wanted to make sure we were like knew what we were talking about before we go into the practical sort of like what do we do in real life when we're engaging with people and we make mistakes because we're human. So the Q for queer, let's talk about it. So when we see that acronym, right, LGBTQ, right, the LGB, right, lesbian, gay, bisexual, those are sexuality terms, right? They're talking about who people like, right? That T is for trans, right? So that's who people are. The Q, right, sometimes historically has stood for questioning, so people who are exploring their gender or sexual identity, right, people who are sort of like figuring it out. It also sometimes stands for the word queer. How many people in this room have heard queer as a negative term or a slur? Yes, like basically everyone, right? How many people as a positive term or like a way that people identify proudly? How many people have heard queer as a positive term? Yeah, right? So fair number. So I often explain to people that queer is a little bit of like a yellow light word, right? So like proceed with caution. Some people love the word queer, right? Identify as queer. Other people still find it very offensive. So we want to be careful about it. The question is though, what does it mean? And I will say the short version is not straight, right? Or not cis. So it means it is another, I think, I would say in some, not cisgender. So not cis. So I would say in some ways it is a proud way to say, right, like not normal. To say like I am not part of the majority experience in a way that's positive is often, I think, how it is used practically. In a longer form, I think it means lots of things to lots of different people. So sometimes it has a little bit of a political connotation, right? So there's a little bit of like not about like a sort of heteronormative life, which is to say like stereotypical sort of gendered experience. I think for some people it is more expansive than a lot of the other sexuality or gender terms because it's not so clearly defined and they don't feel like it's important to have that level of clarity or definition, like it's just not personally important to them. So again, the short version, not straight or not cisgender, depending on whether they're using it as a sexuality or a gender term. Sure. Yeah, I always tell people if it's somebody that you know, like let's say this is like a person that you're close to, like I think you said it was like a family member, right? Okay. So in that case, I think it's totally okay to say like I've heard that term before. Can you tell me what that means for you? Like I want to understand your experience. Not okay to ask that of your like barista at Starbucks. Right? Like not okay to ask that to somebody you don't know, right? Because it's like none of your business really. Somebody that you have a close relationship with where you're clearly coming from a perspective of like I want to understand you, we are close to one another, I care about you, absolutely fine to ask the question. They may say like, no, I don't want to tell you, and that's okay too, right? Yes.
It's possible I misheard, but
I did, in a positive way, like in a like countercultural way.
So I think that that's, I don't know if you can elaborate on that at all, but in as much as the statements that you made leading up to that were very sensitive about
Sure.
not labeling people as being abnormal, I think there's a bit of confusion around somebody who
Sure.
wants to be treated as different, but also is kind of lapsing over to identifying as not normal.
And I think the difference is about whether other people are ascribing that label, right, or someone is claiming that label for themselves, right? So it is different for me to, which is true for me, right? So it is different for me to say, like, I'm queer and I'm proud to be, like, a part of a community that's, like, not the majority, right, or is a different experience, and, like, I don't want to be a part of, like, a normal, whatever that means, like, a normal sort of, like, I'm not trying to fit myself into a box of like what it means to be straight or what people might assume that it means to be straight even as a queer person, right? That's different for me to say that than it is for someone to stand over here and be like, you're weird, which is a little bit of an oversimplification. But I think the point sort of is the difference between having these sort of broader understandings of ways to talk about different kinds of people in a non-judgmental way versus somebody claiming sort of, again, it's a politicized term, so I think there's a political piece of it too around like, I don't want that. Like, I'm not trying to be that, which also comes from, I mean, not to overcomplexify, but from some in-community, like within LGBTQ community politics around people who like want their lives to look sort of like stereotypical versus people who are not prioritizing that. Sure. Yeah, so I think, again, I think it's an individual choice. Like, I don't think queer is a term that is easy to, there are books written about it. I don't think queer is a term that is easy to sort of like put in a box. I think the whole point of it is actually to sort of explode the box, which is why like queer theory is also like an academic discipline that is about exploring ways of thinking outside of binaries, which applies to all different kinds of disciplines too. So Google away at a later time. I want to bring us back a little bit. But I think those are good questions. I don't mean to dismiss your question at all. But I want to bring us back to the practical place. So like, why do we spend time specifically talking about trans and non-binary people, right? Like, why is this important? So sorry, I'm going to do a walk and talk for a minute. So first of all, right, these identities really matter. And they matter from a very early age. So what we know from the research is that children as young as 3 to 5 years old can understand gender and their own gender identity, right? So that is why we say that our program serves young people as young as 4. We don't do it regular programming, but we have at least once a year programs that serve younger children. And that's because we have trans and gender-expansive, very young children, right, in our world. So we want to make sure that those children are respected and supported. That doesn't mean that a 3-year-old is being like, Mom, I'm transgender. They don't know what that word means, right? So we want to be mindful, right, that what this might look like, and when we talk about trans kids who are very small, what that often sounds like or looks like is, when will I grow a penis? When will my penis fall off? Why do you keep calling me a boy? I'm not a boy, I'm a girl. And distress over that, right? Not just like a one-time thing, right? But like consistent, persistent, and insistent. So this sort of like consistent statements, persistent statements, right, that they're going on, and that it's causing distress for this young person. That also doesn't mean that every trans person knows they're trans when they're 4, okay? The other sort of hot time when we see trans identity emerge is around puberty, right, and adolescence. Not shocking, right, because that's a moment when people's bodies are changing in a lot of really gendered ways, and so that can often cause sort of like, speaking into your experience a little bit, right, that can often cause this sort of moment of like, whoa, like not what I wanted, not what I thought, not working for me, right? And then there are people who explore their gender identity much later in their life, right? Don't come out as trans until they're much, much older. All of that is valid, right? It's just important to know that it can happen very, very early. And that the consequences for not supporting trans and gender expansive people are really deadly. And so what we know is that 40% of all trans adults reported having made a suicide attempt, but of those, 92% reported having made an attempt before the age of 25. Which means that like what we do in terms of making supportive communities really impacts how long people live, and really impacts people's safety and sense of mental health. So this is really, I share this, right, because I think it's so important to know that what we do in terms of our supportive behaviors are really life-saving for trans and gender expansive people in our communities, and especially young people. And what's cool is that what we do actually matters. So again, most of the data, because this is the field I work in, looks at young people, but you can see this in terms of employment for adults, like being in supportive workplaces and other things like that. But I love this statistic that 70% of trans young people who reported that they had supportive parents reported that they had very good or excellent mental health, as compared with only 15% of youth with unsupportive parents. The fact that 70% of any group of young people would say that they had excellent mental health, I think is like really awesome. So this really shows the importance, especially of parents and adult family members providing support, which also means that those parents need to feel supported, right, by their community as well. And then looking at schools, right? So this is looking at all LGBTQ students because that's what the data was, but that school with many supportive staff felt safe at school as compared to students with no supportive staff. So again, these supportive adults in our communities, whether that's a faith community or a school community or a family community, that support is really impactful, really makes a difference for people's experiences. So let's talk about pronouns, because this is a really important and impactful way that we can do this in our everyday life. There was some new data that I just saw recently that pronoun use in particular is directly correlated with suicidality for young people. So having many people use your pronouns correctly makes a really big difference in terms of mental health. So they're very directly related. So our most common pronouns, back to grammar. Right, so we're probably most familiar with she, her, he, him, right, as pronouns. Here's some great sentences using those pronouns in a sentence. So when we talk about, I think you brought this up, the sort of like slashes in the words, what do they all mean? I tried to use each one. So this is my friend Alex. She is amazing at carpentry. Her furniture is some of the finest I've seen. That table over there is one of hers, right? We know how to use these in a sentence. And he, him, his, we're pretty familiar with those, right? Then we get into, they, them, theirs, right? Which is where things get a little more interesting. So we're actually pretty familiar, right, with using they, them as a plural pronoun, right, for a group of people. They are going to play badminton or whatever. We also use they, them pronouns as singular without realizing it quite a lot, actually. So someone left their phone, I hope they come back for it. Or like, whose coat is that? Like, oh, it's that person, it's theirs. That person who's walking out the door that we can't see them, you know, because we can't tell what gender we think they are, right? We also might use a singular they, them pronoun when someone asks us to, right? And so this is where we start talking about people who say my pronouns are they, them. So here's how you would use this in a sentence, right? So this is Lee. They're awesome. Let them tell you about their work on fighting hunger in our community, right? So this is someone who's asked you to use they, them pronouns to refer to them. Often, people who use they, them pronouns identify as non-binary, right? So for them, the pronouns he, him, or she, her don't feel comfortable, right? Because those are very gendered pronouns, and if they don't identify as either of those genders, it can feel uncomfortable and invalidating to be referred to with a gendered pronoun. Questions at this point before we talk about how to use them? Oh, and you had a great history question from earlier. Is like, when did this happen? A little bit?
Corollary to my question is, we're being encouraged here, and people in general are being encouraged to declare their pronouns when they introduce themselves. And
Sure. Yeah, so I think the two pieces of that, so let me circle back to that sort of history piece that you asked, and then I'm going to go to your second question, sort of more pressing current question. So when we look at sort of like historically, so what's interesting is people have actually been using singular they, them pronouns for a long time. So I am married to a non-binary person who uses they, them pronouns, and they are older than I am and have been using they, them pronouns for like 15 years. So this is not necessarily like all new, even though it might be new to sort of like popular consciousness. So I think a lot of what we sort of see is this sort of explosion in spaces asking about our pronouns, right? Or, you know, they being like the dictionary word of the year, or like all of that stuff, I think is more about a recognition of trans people, right? Just like a more public awareness that trans people exist and that they're worth talking about and that we should care about supporting them. So I don't know that this idea of using pronouns differently is all new. I think it's just new to sort of like the sort of popular vernacular or sort of like way we engage with one another. And I think especially as social justice communities have been more trans inclusive, right? That sort of shifted the way that our groups work together too. So I think historically, and we'll talk about neo-pronouns in a minute, which I think were actually more common before the singular they. So I'm going to circle back to that. But your other question, sort of speaking into why do we ask people to share their pronouns, right? And is it appropriate to do that? So I share my pronouns when I go into a space, not because I think people are going to misgender me, right? Like if you saw me walking down the street, you would use she, her pronouns for me, right? So I share my pronouns because I want other people to know that if they shared their pronouns with me, I would know what they were talking about, and I'm cool with it. Like I would be able to hear that and receive that information and respond accordingly. So it's not because like I think people are going to misgender me and I'm so upset about it. It's because it's like a little wave, right? To be like, hey, if you want to share your pronouns with me, like I got this. So often, like when I make name tags, I'll put my pronouns on them, whether they're asked for or not, just because I want people to feel comfortable sharing their pronouns with me. So when I hold group spaces, except for when I'm teaching about pronouns, usually when I hold group spaces, I invite people to share their pronouns if they want to, but you don't have to share your pronouns. But I think it's a good way to sort of flag to people that you understand that pronouns might be important to some people in the space, and you want them to feel comfortable sharing with you. So that's why I do it. And that's why I think it's helpful and why we've sort of started seeing it become a more common practice. So maybe my clicker this would really be an ideal time for the clicker. Okay, yeah.
Going back to Lee.
Yes.
I'm always thinking less confusing than
Sorry.
this is Lee, an awesome person who will tell you something having been.
And that's totally correct. What you said is not incorrect. Sure, and I think this is, for sure. And I think this is just an example of our common understandings of language shifting over time, right? And just like how language changes a little bit over time. There's nothing wrong, like especially if you're struggling with someone's pronouns, there's nothing wrong with just using their name. That's okay too, right? You could just be like, this is Lee. Like, Lee can show you about their cool stuff that they're doing. I just said they. But like, Lee could show you about these really great projects that are happening in our community, right? If it feels, that's not wrong, right? What's more important is that you avoid using the wrong pronoun than it is that you use they, them all the time. Totally. Yeah, for sure. So, so thinking about some pro tips here. So like in real life, how do we do this, right? So if you don't know someone's pronouns, right, sometimes it can be helpful to just use a they, them, or just use their name if you know it. So that you don't accidentally misgender someone. Sometimes, right, we might look at someone and think we know their pronouns, but we might be wrong. So wanting to just be thoughtful about that we don't ever actually know someone's pronouns until they tell us. We make educated guesses about people's pronouns, like literally all day long, right? But it's important to remember that they are educated guesses. They are not necessarily known facts, right? We don't actually know until someone has said something to us, so that can be helpful. There we go. Whoops. So this is kind of speaking into what I just said earlier, right? So introducing your own self, like yourself with your pronouns, can be a helpful way to show other people that you're a safe person. So this is also why there's been an increase in people putting pronouns like in their email signatures, right? Same idea, right? Just saying like, if you want to share your pronouns with me, I got it. Like, I know what you're saying. I will be able to receive that information with grace. I will be able to respond to it. So that's part of why we encourage people who are cisgender, right, to share their pronouns, is for this reason. Come on. Oh, so close. There we go. So this sort of, yeah.
People you actually had to say, my name is Mary Ann, he, her, she, her.
Yeah. Totally. I actually, well, and I love that you brought up that distinction. I think that's so important. So my community is probably not a totally universal. I don't know that I'm like the most universal person. I know a lot of people that do that, but I'm weird. But I do think, right, for many people, it goes right over their head if it's not relevant to them. Like if I say, like, my name's Lizzie, my pronouns are she and her, and they don't care, they just like don't even hear that part of what I said. But I think it's so important what you just said about the differentiation between asking for someone's pronouns versus asking for someone's sexuality, and sort of the conflation between that. So using someone's pronouns. Oh, it's okay. I just run around. It's fine. But so asking for someone's pronouns, right, is about asking how to refer to someone respectfully versus asking for someone's sexuality, which is like, who do you have sex with, which is a weird question. Like, that is none of some, like, that's not, right, that's not public information. But how someone gets referred to is kind of like asking when you don't hear someone's name, right, and you like aren't sure exactly what they said, and you ask them to repeat their name because you want to make sure that you know how to refer to them correctly. This is much more, pronouns are much more similar to that than they are to asking someone like how they identify, right? Because you wouldn't be like, you know, like, hi, I'm Lizzie and I'm cisgender. Like, that would be weird, right? And that doesn't help you. That doesn't help you engage with me better, right? But when I say, I am Lizzie, my pronouns are she, her, then you know how to refer to me when I walk out of, when I'm like not here, or when, you know, I say something that you want to refer back to or whatever. Yes.
I'm just remembering when we went through the myths is myths.
Yes.
Business.
Yes.
You know, to honor where people, how people.
Correct. Yes. Very similar to the honorific conversation. Yes. Yes.
I just want to say on that same thing, before we found out about our son just 2 weeks ago, I've been seeing the past few years a lot more of people identifying female, masculine, male. And I don't necessarily go and introduce myself for the first time and introduce my pronouns, but I started a while ago trying to do more of that on emails, partly feeling like, for me, who I'm a pretty regular person, trying to create that safe space and normalize it. So it's not only the people who are trying to kind of
Sure.
claw their way out of the minority saying, here, please make this normal, but as a supportive person and environment, trying to create that to say, again, this is normal, we can all do this, and that kind of safe space.
Sure, right? It's a way to use our privilege, right, to create safer spaces for other people. Learning new pronouns, I want to be mindful of time, so I want to move us forward, but learning new pronouns, right, this can be really hard for people. So like if you've known someone with she, her pronouns your whole life, and then they want you to call them by they, them pronouns, you are just not going to get that overnight. It's just not going to happen for you. And that is okay. That does not mean you are a bad person. It does not mean you are failing, even if it is your own child. It is not like you are not bad because you can't get this right overnight. There's a cognitive thing that has to happen, right? So please be kind to yourself if you are struggling with someone's pronouns, and practice. The way to get better at it is to practice. I recently heard a story of someone who like gave all their plants pronouns in their house to like practice with their plants, which I thought was really funny. Like I said, I have a non-binary partner who uses they, them pronouns. That was very hard for my mom. So she would like, when she hung out with her friends, would like talk way more about my partner than about me. Just to practice, right? Just to practice using the pronouns, and asked her friends to correct her when she used the wrong pronoun. That is the best way to get better at it, is to practice. This is my whole job, and I misgender people too. Like, it's okay. But we also have a responsibility to get better and to be better, right? And so part of showing care, right, and demonstrating care is continuing to work on it. It's not about being perfect. It's about showing that we care, right, by continuing to grow and continuing to work towards it. So I like to make sure that we know this. This does raise the question, though, of what do we do when we do it wrong, right? So what do we do when we make that mistake? And you will make that mistake, right? You correct yourself, you apologize, and you move on, right? Be cool. Do not take this as the moment to be like, oh my God, your pronouns, I'm really working on them. I swear I'm really working on them. Like, I'm so sorry. Like, I'm just the worst. Like, because people really do that. Like, that is, I know it's like I'm being a little exaggerated right now, but like, it's true. Yes, thank you for the, yes. It's very true. People really do that, right? Because I think it's often authentic, right? People really do feel bad. But then what does that do to the other person? Yeah, and then they have to do what? Take care of my feelings, right? Yeah, caretake, apologize. No, it's okay, it's okay. It's like not okay, right? So just, when I'm talking about like Lee, like they went to the store and they're getting their drink and they'll be back in a little bit or whatever, right? We just carry on, be cool, right? If somebody corrects you, right? If somebody offers you a correction, say thank you, right? Thank you. They da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, right? Especially if the person is correcting you, that's not the moment to say sorry, because then they have to say it's okay, right? So you just say thanks, da-da-da-da-da, right? And carry on with your life. Most of the time, people will just appreciate it if you correct yourself and move forward. It's possible that someone might have a big reaction to you. You don't have a clue what else has happened in their day. For all you know, you're the 50th person who has misgendered them today, and they've just had enough. So try not to take that personally, right? That doesn't mean, again, that you're a terrible person. It just means like that person's having a really bad day. And try to sort of hold that as much as you can. And then the last, questions about that? Okay, and then the last piece of this, right, is that we can also be in community with one another and correct each other, right? So if you hear somebody misgender someone else, right, or use the wrong pronoun, you can gently correct them, right? Do not make the trans person correct people every single time. Like, that just doesn't, it sucks to be that, like, it sucks to have to be, like, nobody wants to be like the language police, right? That's not fun. But also people want to be referred to respectfully, and so that is a great moment where you can be like, oh, it's they. And the person will be like, thank you. They, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, whatever they're saying, right? Is that a hand? Sure. Yeah, and so I think this is something, especially if you're in close community with somebody where people are often misgendering them, you can have a conversation with someone directly about this and be like, hey, would you rather me correct people like in real time, or would you rather me talk offline? I will say the vast majority of people would prefer that you correct in the moment. Because it's also like, if other people hear the wrong pronoun, then like it confuses what people know. Also, people get better at it when they're corrected in the moment too, but you can always have that conversation individually. So again, I know we're over time, so I'm just gonna leave it there. I know I said I was gonna talk about neopronouns, but I'm not. But if you wanna know, yeah, you can Google it later, learn about it later. But I do wanna leave you with my contact information in case you have other questions or wanna talk further. I am more than happy to do that with you. Thanks for showing up so brilliantly to this conversation with such thoughtful questions and care. It's always like awesome to get to hear from folks in the community doing this. So thank you, and happy, beautiful fall day outside.